I didn't set out to connect the Rothschild family to Tartarian royalty. I was researching 19th century banking records, tracing capital flows through Frankfurt, Vienna, and London, mapping the usual financial networks, when I noticed something odd. Not a single document, not one discrepancy, but a pattern of missing genealogical connections that once you see it, you can't unsee it. The story we're told is almost mythological in its simplicity. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, born in the Frankfurt Judengasse around 1744, built a banking empire from nothing through genius, hard work, and opportunity. He had 5 sons, strategically placed them in 5 European financial centers: Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Paris, Naples, and together they created the most powerful banking dynasty in history. From ghetto to global dominance in 2 generations, it's the ultimate rags to riches narrative. But the deeper I looked, the more gaps appeared in this perfectly constructed story. Start with a simple exercise. Try to trace the Rothschild family line before Mayer Amschel. Go back just 2 or 3 generations. What you'll find is remarkable. For a family that has documented every transaction, every marriage, every property acquisition with obsessive precision for 250 years, the genealogical record before 1740 becomes remarkably sparse. Compare this to other banking families of the era. The Medicis we can trace back to the 1300s. The Fuggers, detailed records to the 1400s. Even the Warburgs and Oppenheimers have clear lineages extending centuries before their rise to prominence. But the Rothschilds? The trail goes cold around 1740. Not incomplete, cold, as if their history began the moment it became useful to the narrative. And then there's the name itself, Rothschild, Red Shield. We're told it came from the red shield that hung outside Mayer Amschel's house in Frankfurt. But here's what troubles me. In the historical records of Frankfurt's Jewish quarter, that red shield symbol appears nowhere before 1760. Nowhere. For a family supposedly identified by this symbol for generations, there's no documentation of it existing before Mayer Amschel's sudden prominence. What did that red shield represent? The official explanation is simple heraldic identification. But when you study Central Asian and Siberian royal symbolism from the 1600s and 1700s, you find red shield imagery repeatedly associated with specific noble lineages, not European lineages, Tartarian lineages. Families that controlled trade routes, mining operations, and financial networks across vast territories. The symbol didn't originate in Frankfurt. It was transplanted there. This raises a critical question. For a family that would become obsessed with documenting legitimacy, with proving their right to nobility, with establishing their place in European aristocracy, why would they accept such a thin genealogical foundation? Unless that foundation was deliberately thin, unless the real ancestry needed to be obscured, unless Rothschild wasn't a beginning, but a continuation under a new name. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe these genealogical gaps are simply the normal erosion of records from Jewish communities that faced persecution and displacement. That's the reasonable explanation. Then I started looking at what the Rothschilds built, not the businesses they acquired, the buildings they constructed, and that's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Pull up images of Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, England, built for Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild between 1874 and 1889. Now look at Chateau de Ferrières, built for Baron James de Rothschild from 1855 to 1859. Then Villa F. Russi de Rothschild in the French Riviera, completed in 1912. Now look at Rothschild palaces in Vienna, the Palais Rothschild, constructed in the 1870s. What do you notice? Not just similar styles, identical proportion systems, the same mathematical relationships between height and width, the same ratios in window placements, the same load-bearing techniques, the same spatial organization principles. This isn't European neoclassical architecture with some personal flourishes. These buildings speak a different architectural language entirely. And it's the same language used in Tartarian imperial structures across Central Asia and Siberia during the 1700s. Look at the golden ratio applications in Warburgs and Oppenheimer's facade. Look at the symmetrical organization of Ferrières with its central dome and wing proportions. These aren't coincidental similarities. These require specific technical knowledge, knowledge of atmospheric harmonics, knowledge of construction at massive scale without modern engineering, knowledge that European architects in the 1850s and 1860s shouldn't have possessed because it wasn't part of European architectural tradition, but it was part of Tartarian architectural tradition. Here's what troubles me most. When you research the architects hired to build these Rothschild palaces, you find something strange. Many trained in Vienna, Prague, and other Central European cities. But when you try to trace where they learned these specific techniques, where this knowledge was transmitted, the trail goes cold. Not everywhere, just at the critical transmission points, just where the knowledge would have originated. And here's the timing you cannot ignore. Waddesdon Manor, construction begins 1874. Château de Ferrières, 1855. Palais Rothschild, Vienna, 1870s. Every major Rothschild palace was built between 1850 and 1890, the exact period when Tartarian territories were being completely erased from European maps. Not before, not after, during. Now, let's talk about money, because the Rothschild fortune story has always had a problem at its foundation. The official narrative tells us Mayer Amschel started with modest capital from trading coins in antiques, then leveraged connections to German nobility. His big break came managing finances for Wilhelm IX of Hesse-Kassel. From there, his 5 sons exploited the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars to build vast fortunes. But here's the mathematical impossibility. The scale of capital deployment the Rothschilds achieved by 1815 doesn't match the documented revenue sources. To place the bets they placed, to fund the operations they funded, to establish the banking infrastructure they established across 5 cities simultaneously, you need starting capital in quantities that the official story can't account for. The Battle of Waterloo intelligence story is famous. Nathan Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat early, manipulated British bond markets, made a fortune. But that story requires something we're never told. Where did Nathan get the capital to exploit that information in the first place? What if they didn't build wealth? What if they inherited it? What if the Rothschild banking network wasn't new, but old? What if Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Paris, and Naples weren't chosen randomly, but strategically, because they were positions in a pre-existing financial infrastructure? An infrastructure that needed new management because its previous controllers had disappeared from history, or more precisely, had been erased from maps. The Rothschild banking system appeared fully formed, not gradually developed. Fully formed. 5 sons in 5 cities with synchronized operations, established relationships with nobility, access to state finances, and coordination that would have taken decades to build organically, yet appeared functional within years. Does that sound like a startup, or does that sound like a takeover of existing infrastructure? Before you dismiss this as speculation, I need you to look at something else. I need you to look at maps, because maps don't lie the way official histories can lie. They show what was known, what was believed, what existed in the minds of those who drew them. Pull up a map of Europe from 1750. Now mark the Rothschild banking centers: Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Paris, and Naples. Now pull up a map showing Tartarian trade routes from the same period. Maps drawn by French cartographers, Dutch merchants, British explorers. Look at the major trade nodes, the financial centers, the crossroads where goods and gold moved between East and West. The correlation is impossible to ignore. Frankfurt sat at the junction of Central European and Northern European trade routes that extended eastward into Tartarian territories. Vienna was the gateway between Western Europe and the vast Tartarian interior. London controlled maritime routes that connected to Baltic trade networks, feeding Siberian resources westward. Paris controlled continental trade, flowing from Mediterranean connections to Tartarian ports. Naples sat at the Mediterranean nexus, where Central Asian goods entered European markets.
Here's what troubles me most. These weren't new financial centers. They were old financial centers. Centers that had been managing east-west capital flows for centuries. The Rothschilds didn't create these networks, they inherited them. Or more precisely, they were positioned in them. 5 sons in 5 cities. Not expansion, reclamation. Not building an empire, securing territories. Now watch what happens on those maps over time. Between 1750 and 1820, Tartarian territory labels begin shrinking. Between 1820 and 1850, they disappear almost entirely. By 1860, you can find maps where Tartaria isn't labeled at all, replaced by Russian territories, Chinese territories, Ottoman claims. A civilization that covered a third of Asia, gone from maps in 1 century. And during that exact century, a banking family appears fully formed to manage the financial infrastructure those territories generated. Now I need you to look at Rothschild heraldry. Not casually, carefully. The family coat of arms features 5 arrows held together by a fist. The official explanation is simple: 5 brothers, arrows represented unified. But arrow symbolism has a much older meaning in Central Asian royal traditions. In Tartarian, Mongolian, and Siberian noble families, arrows represented claims to territory, lineage connections, inherited authority. This isn't European heraldic tradition. European families used lions, eagles, shields, crosses. Arrows appear in Central Asian royal symbolism with specific meanings related to ancestral claims and territorial inheritance. The number 5 in particular carries weight in Central Asian numerology related to cardinal directions and administrative divisions. 5 sons in 5 territories isn't business strategy, it's traditional territorial administration. Look at what Rothschilds collected, not just the famous art, the other items, the manuscripts, the historical documents, the antiquities. Baron Edmond de Rothschild amassed one of the world's largest collections of historical maps, particularly maps of Asia. Baron Ferdinand collected artifacts from Central Asia and Siberia with obsessive focus. These weren't random collector interests, these were preservation efforts. What were they preserving? And more importantly, what were they preventing others from studying?
There are references in historical correspondence, brief mentions that slip through, of the Rothschild family using phrases and terms in private communication that weren't German, weren't Hebrew, weren't any of the languages they publicly used. Estate managers, tutors, and servants occasionally mentioned here in conversations in what they described as Eastern languages. These references are rare, often dismissed, never investigated. What language were they speaking when they thought no one was listening? The Rothschild family motto is Concordia, Integritas, Industria, harmony, integrity, industry. Latin, proper, European. But earlier family seals, the ones used before they received European noble titles, contain inscriptions that historical records describe vaguely as traditional, without specifying what tradition. When historians have asked to examine these early seals more closely, the family has been remarkably protective. Why? What's on those seals that can't be shown? Before you dismiss this as conspiracy thinking, consider this. The Rothschild family has funded more historical research, more genealogical studies, more archival projects than perhaps any family in history. They're obsessed with documentation. They preserve everything except one thing. They've never funded or permitted a comprehensive genetic study of the family bloodline. In an era when every other noble family in Europe has had their DNA analyzed, studied, mapped, the Rothschilds remain genetically undocumented. Why would the most documented family in modern history avoid genetic documentation? What markers might appear that don't match the official Frankfurt ghetto origin story? Central Asian markers? Siberian genetic signatures? The kind of DNA evidence that would place their ancestry thousands of miles east of Frankfurt. The same genetic silence we see in European royal families who might share that same ancestry. We have the technology now. We can trace ancestry through DNA with precision that would confirm or refute genealogical claims that once relied solely on documents that can be lost, destroyed, or rewritten. DNA can't be rewritten. So why hasn't there been testing? Not informal testing, comprehensive, peer-reviewed, published genetic mapping of the Rothschild bloodline. The silence is deafening. Count the fires. Make a list of archives that burned between 1800 and 1900 in cities where Rothschilds operated. The Frankfurt City Archives, partial destruction, 1848. The Vienna Financial Records Archive, fire in 1869. The Naples Administrative Records, fires in 1857 and 1885. And these are just the documented major fires. Smaller fires affecting specific genealogical records, property registries, banking archives. The list grows uncomfortably long. Here's what troubles me most: the timing of these fires. They didn't happen randomly across centuries. They clustered in a narrow window, 1840s through 1880s. The exact period when Rothschild's wealth solidified, when their noble titles were officially formalized, when their genealogies were being officially documented for European aristocracy's acceptance. Right when old records would need to be verified, those records suffered convenient disasters. Now, I want you to see something. I want you to see the timeline as a whole. 1744, Mayer Amschel Rothschild born, the official beginning of the family history. But 1740s through 1770s, Tartarian territories are rapidly disappearing from maps, political structures collapsing, being absorbed. 1815, Battle of Waterloo. Rothschild financial dominance becomes undeniable across Europe.
1850s through 1880s, Tartarian labels completely erased from maps, replaced entirely by Russian, Chinese, and Ottoman claims. And simultaneously, 1850s through 1890s, Rothschild palace construction across Europe using architectural techniques from that vanished civilization. Not coincidence, coordination. One system ending, another beginning, using the same families, the same infrastructure, the same territorial organization, just under new names.
Look at other banking families that rose during the same period. The Warburgs, origins in Venice, but sudden prominence in Hamburg in the 1700s. The Oppenheimers, sudden appearance in Cologne with established networks. The Sassoons, appearing in Baghdad, then rapidly expanding to India and China. Each one appears with suspicious readiness, with infrastructure that seems inherited, not built, during the exact period when Tartarian political structures were vanishing. Each one appears with suspicious readiness, with infrastructure that seems inherited, not built, during the exact period when Tartarian political structures were vanishing. And it raises a question that changes everything. What if these weren't separate families building new empires? What if they were branches of older administrative systems being repositioned, renamed, documented into new official histories? What if the Rothschilds weren't self-made, but selected? What does it all mean? Maybe nothing. Maybe I'm seeing connections in coincidences. Maybe genealogical gaps are just normal historical erosion. Maybe architectural similarities are just shared aesthetic preferences. Maybe financial impossibilities are just incomplete records. Maybe the timing is just unfortunate correlation. But what if it's not nothing? What if the Rothschild family isn't a Frankfurt success story, but a relocated nobility? What if their banking empire didn't start in a ghetto, but inherited continental networks from Tartarian financial administrators? What if the 5 sons weren't entrepreneurs, but territorial governors? What if the name change from whatever it was before marked a transition from one system to another, from Tartarian administration to European integration? What if the wealth didn't come from genius, but from preservation of pre-existing treasure? What if the red shield symbol wasn't adopted in Frankfurt, but carried from somewhere east? What if the architectural knowledge wasn't learned, but remembered? What if the genetic tests haven't been done because the family already knows what they would show? What if the fires that destroyed records weren't accidents, but necessities? What if the maps that erased Tartaria were redrawn by the same hands that rewrote the Rothschild origin story? Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The architecture speaks a language older than Frankfurt. The timing tells a story different than the official history. The genealogical silence is louder than any document. And somewhere in the margins, in the burned archives, in the erased maps, in the genetics that won't be tested, there might be another story. A story about who really controlled the wealth we think was built in the 1800s. A story we're not supposed to remember. But once you see it, you can't unsee it.